It is now my pleasure to introduce Qais Fakiri. Qais was born and raised in Kabul, Afghanistan. He first became a refugee in Pakistan when the Taliban took over Afghanistan in 1996. He returned to Afghanistan in 2001 and joined Doctors Without Borders, where he helped bring healthcare to rural areas. He had a stint as a reporter for the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, and then joined the NATO-led International Security Assistance Force, promoting culture-sensitive communication between residents of northern Afghanistan and NATO forces. Qais came to the US as a Fulbright Scholar in 2007 to study journalism at Ball State University. Upon graduation, he joined the US Marine Corps as a civilian, helping to train Marines about Afghanistan, its people, and its culture, along with teaching basic Farsi, Dari, and Pashto language. He then joined the Voice of America in Washington, where he covered Afghanistan news and hosted political talk shows. He was deployed with the US Army to Afghanistan as a linguist and cultural advisor, where he helped transition the command of the detention center to Afghanistan authorities. Qais returned to Ball State in 2013 and earned his master's degree in political science in 2014. He then returned to Afghanistan to work as a peace builder. He joined USAID to support higher education and managed university partnerships between Afghanistan and American universities. He was the director of cultural affairs at the Kabul municipality before the fall of Kabul to the Taliban in August 2021. He currently works at the Immigrant Welcome Center as manager of marketing and communications. And in this role, he's committed to promoting the acceptance of refugees and immigrants by telling their stories. He helps to raise awareness about the challenges that refugees and immigrants face in Indiana. And so with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to you, Qais.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. It was a very long and nice introduction. So you did justice to what I have to, because it creates credibility with my audience. And some of them are hiding, I can't see them, hello. And some of them are brave, I see them. So I know I have a limited amount of time, so I have to jump into my PowerPoint and talk about the Immigrant Welcome Center and my role and my passion for helping immigrants in our city. And I will talk briefly about some immigrant statistics, languages, our clients and all that. And then I'll move on to focus more specific on the newcomers from Afghanistan. As educators, you're dealing with 6-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 9-year-olds, teens, and understanding them, because there was, before that, there was no exposure. And now there is exposure. And as a teacher, it's your passion. And I respect that passion. That's why I'm here. I respect your passion for educating the minds of the future generation. A future generation where we don't receive refugees, we receive tourists, and tourists who enjoy our food, enjoy our parks, enjoy everything, and go home and have a home to go to. And in order to understand the trauma that these kids have experienced, we require some stories, some storytelling. And I'm really honored to be among the educators in Central Indiana. And I see people from all over Indiana, so I can't say Central Indiana. Initially, I thought it was a Central Indiana thing. And my goal here today is to jog your interest, because I have worked in higher education and I have seen American way of thinking in education with the actual world. And in order to understand the culture, we have to see their culture through their lenses, take off our lenses. And in order to know them basically as humans, as little humans that are in our care, to educate and help them become the potential, help them become the future generation. So that was my prepared speech, if you may, and I'm going to turn I'm going to share my screen and start with PowerPoint, but a lot of these stories are embedded in the PowerPoint. So as I mentioned, I work with Immigrant Welcome Center. And last year, we received quite a few families from Afghanistan. And these families come from all walks of life. What we do as Immigrant Welcome Center is to empower these families so they can bring up their children as good human beings. Because when immigrants themselves, they struggle and they suffer, you see it in their kids, you see it in their families, and the potentials are lost. We have organizational objectives. This information is all available on our website. Anybody who is interested to dig deep and know the organization behind this, they can go on our website. But to better understand our own social identity and culture, because we as Immigrant Welcome Center, we deal with people from all over the world. We can't possibly speak all the languages. We can't possibly read all the books from all those cultures and languages. But what we do, we try. We just started our program of it's a training. It's called cultural bias training, and we do help people understand the culture. To enhance learning and awareness, identify ways to support immigrant population in Indiana. And today we will talk about general migration around the world, a little bit of touch base on it, and cultural social identity, Afghanistan and US cultural norms, Immigrant Welcome Center resources. So these are the topics I'm going to talk about. So as you see in the data that's available, international migrants, 281 million people globally, up from 272. So people are moving due to armed conflicts, all kinds of social problems, due to bare work opportunities for this reason or that, they are immigrating. But 89.4 people are displaced by force because of conflict. They didn't want to leave their homelands. They were forced to flee. Natural disasters, human-made disasters, and all kind of disasters. You can see these statistics on migration worldwide. I'm not going to dwell on it a lot. It's general information available. But I just to bring the point home, I wanna show this slide to show that the world actually lives in our neighborhoods, in our city. Their stories, their struggles, their suffering, all of it lives in our city. 7.1% of Indianapolis area foreign-born, 5.3 Indiana foreign-born population, 100,000 undocumented immigrants, 1 in 10 speaks another language. Top 5 places of origin: Mexico 24%, India 6%, China 5%, Philippines 4.5%, El Salvador 3%. That's the US. Top 5 places of origin for Indiana migrants: Mexico, India, China, Myanmar, Burma, Philippines. Top 5 places of origin for Indianapolis immigrants: 24, 10, 6, 4, 9, 4 and 5.5. These are but just numbers. They don't tell the real story. And the real story is in the hearts and minds of these immigrants themselves. So as Immigrant Welcome Center, we want to highlight these stories. We want to introduce people to know, to understand. So Afghanistan immigrants who arrived recently, they're spread all over Indiana. We have people in Indianapolis, we have people in Muncie. Anybody from Muncie here? We have people in Bloomington and spread in other cities in smaller amounts and numbers. So they don't even make it into the percentages and numbers. That's your marginalized population. They don't make it. They are not in top 5. They are not in top 10 because the numbers are so small that cannot compete with more bigger numbers. Now I'm switching topic and I'm talking now about Afghanistan more generally, but that was our overview of Immigrant Welcome Center and immigration generally in Indiana. Now, culture has 5 pillars. You pick your favorite, it's still 5 pillars. You have to come up with 5 pillars. Symbols, language, norms, values, rituals. These are all important to the 7-year-old, to the 10-year-old in your class. All you know as symbols, language, norms, values, rituals were alien to them last year at this time. Now they are exposed to a complete new system of living, system of thinking, system of loving, system of spending time in nature. All of these are new. You can only see the tip of the iceberg when you're exposed as a teacher. You have limited time, you have limited resources, and you really want to help, but the student is struggling, the student is suffering, the student is traumatized, and the student is not paying attention, or all of this and that. And in order, as an educator, to tend to this student, you need to understand the student, their needs. And that's where we can do a comparison of the US and Afghanistan. You know the US, I don't have to repeat that here for you, preach to the choir. But Afghanistan culture, languages, Farsi, Dari. Farsi is what's called in Afghanistan. Pashto, Uzbek, Turkmen, Baluchi, Pashtuni, Nuristani, etc. There are 30 different languages spoken in the country for millennia. Food is mostly grains-based because it's an agricultural society and people subside on the basic product or fruits of the earth. Vegetables, fruits, and I put meat at last because meat is a luxury. It's not like a kid can have meat anytime, any day he or she wants. It's not like that. And some spices, Afghanistan food is not as spicy as Pakistan or India. We use spices sparingly. And we tend to spice our food with garlic and onions and tomatoes. So we get more fresh spices there. Festivals and celebrations, Nowruz, that's also called Iranian New Year. Eid al-Fitr, Eid al-Adha, Ramadan, and Ashura. And all of these I'm naming here are significant days of cultural and religious significance. And Nowruz is the new year. It's on the 21st of March every year, and the celebration of rebirth of nature, rebirth of life. And it has been celebrated in Afghanistan and Iran and Central Asia and Turkey and Lebanon, all over the place for millennia. There are some numbers out there. Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha. Eid al-Fitr is after Ramadan, which is the month of Muslim fasting. Eid al-Adha is the month of sacrifice, and it has religious roots to the Prophet Abraham taking Ishmael to sacrifice for God. And God sends a lamb instead. And so now Muslims sacrifice lamb instead. Ramadan is a 30 days of fasting, and Ashura is it's a mourning ritual. And it's because of the injustices that was applied to the Prophet Muhammad's grandson. He was killed with 72 of his followers, and and justice was never served. So it's a mourning. Personal space, length of your hand, hand over heart means friendship, love, and peace, and also welcome. So if you meet the parents of your student from Afghanistan and they put their hands over their heart, that means I have peace in my heart for you. And also the word salam alaikum actually means peace be upon you. And the significance of that is when a Muslim says peace be upon you, he is reaffirming that there is peace between you and me. I'm not here to harm you. I'm not here to loot you. I'm not here to do anything. I'm here for friendship. Feet are dirty. You don't throw your feet at someone. Religion, Islam is 99.9% of the country. Collectivist culture, yes. Family is the top priority. Individual wants are priority number 3 or 4, depending on the family. But family as a collective is the top priority. In a person's life, marriage is the milestone. So a boy or a girl, anytime they marry, and the age of marriage in Islam is different in what's legal here. Family is made up of man and woman. If I can explain it a little poetically, it would be a relationship of the heart and the reason. And mother provides all the emotional needs of her child. And father looks after providing all the physical needs. Physical needs include having food, having a bicycle, having somebody to take them to their sporting event or things like that. Now, how much this is practiced, it's another question, but that's the philosophy behind family in Afghanistan. Marriage is when 2 men and women come together under the dictates of the religion or Islam to bond and to create a family, to put the unit of a family. But when a man marries a woman, she brings the bride home, and for him, home is the family. The same shared space with mom, dad, brother, sister, everybody. He brings his bride to the family. And when a woman marries, she leaves the house and goes to her in-laws' house and becomes. Nowadays, it's more like a TV shows show that in shows that as the king or the queen, things like that. But in the basic sense, it still applies in Afghanistan. Father is the reason, and also the what's the word for somebody who looks after the behavior. He plays the role of a discipliner, that's the word. And mother always has the child's good at heart. She is the one working between father and the child as a team to raise the child together. So sometimes she takes the side of the husband, and sometimes she takes the side of the child, because disputes are supposed to arise anyway, inevitable. Son and daughter, because now culturally, this needs a little more clarification. Culturally, a son is the one who replaces father in the family unit after his death and takes all his responsibility to the family. Now, father has responsibility to all the children and the wife. So son takes over that responsibility. Because the daughter leaves the family in marriage and becomes part of another family, it's mostly sons are preferred, because here you have pensions, you have 401ks, when you retire and grow old, you always have that cushion. But in Afghanistan, it's not a cushion. There, people don't have pensions or 401ks. Their investment throughout their life is their son. And the bear, they have prepared their son for life. The bear, he can take care of them in the old. Now, education in Islam, because 99.9% of the people from Afghanistan are Muslim, and your students will be Muslim. So Islam makes education a duty to every Muslim man and woman. Now, there's no difference between education and jihad. So God says this, uses the same word duty for both. It's not different. Education is not different than going to Mecca for a Muslim. It's not different from prayer. It's at the same level. Now, how much is practiced in the society and among the Muslim population, that's a different story. Now, Prophet Muhammad says, seek knowledge from cradle to the grave. That's Prophet Muhammad saying it. School system, separate schools for boys and girls, co-education only at the university level. Teacher is deemed the spiritual father or mother of the pupil. It's Afghanistan, so it's mostly when they say this out loud in speeches, in conversations, they say father. I added mother because I know the role woman plays in teaching any children, but it's mostly they refer to father. Learning is the responsibility of both the teacher and the student. So here's the system difference. Here, I have been educated in both the Afghanistan system and the US system. In the US system, when the teacher gives you a homework, that's your duty to finish. Now, if you have a question, you can go back to the teacher. But if not, the teacher expects you to learn that, to do that. Now, in Afghanistan, it's a two-way responsibility. If the student fails the class, they hold the teacher responsible as much as the student. And because of that, it brings the student and teacher together to work on problems. The teacher is a guide, so he dictates or she dictates what the student needs to learn at that point in time in the semester or in the school year to grow. Grades are public knowledge, so everybody knows who got what. And they make fun of the people who failed the class. They make fun of its kids. They do it. But it's public knowledge. And the goal of each student, the goal of parents and the goal of the school system is to get everyone to the top. So everybody wants the individual student to be in the top. And everybody makes it there at their own level. I have a quote from Ali Karamallahu Wajhahu. He was the fourth prophet of Islam. Anyone who teaches me a word is my spiritual father. And that's part of the cultural look at the education system. I have a slide for questions here, but here are some numbers about how many people we have served so far last year. And yeah,
It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Erin Aquino. Erin currently serves as the Resettlement Director for Exodus Refugee Immigration Sub-Office in Bloomington. Erin has worked with immigrant populations as well as abroad, in the US as well as abroad, for over a decade. She graduated with her master's in social work as a Peace Corps Coverdell Fellow at New Mexico State University in 2021. And early in her career, she served in the AmeriCorps program, City Year Chicago, working with youth. And she served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Senegal. As a graduate student, she developed a new immigrant advocacy center and gained clinical skills as a therapist. Erin is dedicated to confronting and overcoming oppressive barriers and systems alongside disadvantaged but incredibly resilient individuals and communities. She's excited to once again be welcoming refugees in Indiana. And so, Erin, thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me to be here. So glad to be with you all. I'm setting a timer for myself because I'm not as good about keeping things in the time frame. So oh, come on, computer. Okay, so I work with Exodus Refugee. We are the one of the refugee resettlement agencies in Indiana. So I've been based out of Indianapolis for about 40 years. And then we just opened up our sub office here in Bloomington in January of this year. I know that probably doesn't mean much for people out of the state, but this is our mission statement. We're committed to the protection of the human rights of the clients that we serve that are going through the resettlement process in our cities. And I'm going to get into some of the specifics about a little bit of the difference between immigration overall and working specifically with refugees, which is what we do. So super, super basic. And I love to pick on groups, but does anyone want to share, and not the doctors in the room, no offense, but does anyone want to share what the definition of a refugee is? Who's brave? You're teachers. I know you're all brave. Anybody? I will call on people. Pete. I know because you know, my friend.
A refugee is a person that applies outside the country under the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. There's 5 categories of persecution that was established by the 1951 Accords. And if you are persecuted because of your race, your sex, your political activities, your social group, there's 5 categories. And so that's what a refugee is. You apply through UNHCR, and then they will pass you to the for vetting process, and they hand you off to Exodus and Catholic Charities and people like that.
Thanks, Pete. I know Pete knows his stuff. That's why I called on him. He runs an agency in Bloomington as well, serving immigrants. But yes, this is a definition from the UN, and it is those specific groups. I would love to spend hours talking about, is this a limited definition for populations that have been displaced? You may notice some things that are missing here. Climate refugees don't fall under this definition, but we don't have the time, unfortunately, to get into that. But to know that it is a very specific status internationally, but then it is even more of a specific status for the United States. So U.S. resettlement. So some perspective, Kais gave some of the general numbers, right, of people that are displaced. It's around 80 million. We're getting close to about 30 million people that fit the refugee definition. And some perspective with numbers is that less than 1% of this population gets the opportunity to resettle in a country like the United States or countries that offer resettlement. Only about under 30 countries offer programs like this. So when we're talking about refugees in America, we're talking about extremely small population of people that get this kind of a program. So for the US, right, we had established this process in 1980. And since then, we've welcomed roughly 3 million refugees. Every year, the president sets what's called the PD, presidential determination, of the ceiling of the number of refugees with specific refugee status that are welcomed to the US. This year, it was set at 125,000. It's a fiscal year. The year's almost over. We've welcomed under 18,000. So we are significantly off from hitting that number. I'll get into that a little bit. But the focus of U.S. resettlement is on the most vulnerable. So it's important to understand that, right? When we're talking about working with refugee kiddos, immigrant kiddos, we're looking at survivors of violence and torture, women at risk, refugees with serious medical issues, mental health issues. And that is the focus of the US. It's something I'm really proud of our country for being able to do that. Not everybody has designated the most vulnerable people to be resettled. I do not expect you to understand this, and I will not go through every detail of this, but I want you to understand that it is one of the hardest ways to get to the US as an immigrant is through the refugee process. It's incredibly complicated. There's a lot of it. It takes years to get through. There's been exceptions to that, and I'll get into that. But incredibly complicated. It's not easy. We get a lot of the way people come to the US as refugees is connecting with family. I've seen families take 10 years, over 10 years to get reunified with family members. So it's not a perfect system. I guess what is, but here's some numbers, right? In 1980, we actually welcomed our highest numbers of refugees, about 250,000. And you can see it fluctuates, and you can see, and maybe you can make the connection, but under the Trump administration is when we've seen some of the lowest numbers of welcoming refugees as a nation. They were very successful in dismantling the program, which is why, even though we have an administration that is open to welcoming more refugees, we are nowhere hitting that number because they decimated the system from here to overseas. There's been a new appointee in the State Department that oversees the program, and there's lots of talk about making some hard changes for fiscal year 23. So we're hoping for an increase in number, but frankly, it will take years to remedy what happened under that administration. So Indiana, we have 4 cities currently and 3 agencies that are refugee resettlement agencies. So we are designated public-private partnership with the government to provide the upfront services for refugees. Again, a very specific status. Places like the Immigrant Welcome Center, the Bloomington Refugee Welcome Center or Support Center here in Bloomington, they're able to serve a wide range of people with immigrant statuses, but agencies like Exodus, it's very specific. And I'll show you a little bit more of what those statuses look like. Also important to note, in other states, you have refugee resettlement agencies just like ours. But we may be expanding to other cities in the state of Indiana. Bloomington just opened. It's been a great fit in Indiana. We often have a lot of available jobs. Up until recently, we've had very affordable housing. That is no longer accurate. Bloomington's an incredibly welcoming community and actually a very diverse community for being in central southern Indiana. If you're out of state, you're like, Central Indiana, you got it. We're diverse too sometimes. Where do people come from? So just in my little agency alone, in our 4-year history, we've welcomed people from this many countries. So sometimes we get caught up in the news. Oh, or Afghans are refugees, Ukrainians are refugees. Yes, and many, many other populations are refugees in dealing with conflict akin to what's happening in Afghanistan and Ukraine. So here's kind of the diversity of what we've seen. I'm sure that's even greater for somewhere like Immigrant Welcome Center. And the countries in blue are the ones that we've been welcoming most recently. So getting in the weeds a little bit, it's my favorite thing to do. Refugee is a very specific immigration status, but agencies like ours can actually serve a few more statuses, and we kind of designate them as what has been called groups of humanitarian concern. So refugees, special immigrant visa holders, they tend to come from countries like Iraq, Afghanistan. We've been welcoming Afghan SIVs for years now. These are people who've generally worked with military overseas in the Middle East. Asylees, people who've come to the border, they didn't get processed overseas, but they came to our border either at the border or have crossed the border legally or maybe not, can apply for asylum to remain just like a refugee. Cuban and Haitian entrants, we don't have the time to get into it, but they are eligible for it. It is complicated. Certified victims of human trafficking, also pre-certified victims of human trafficking, asylum seekers, and people with parole, which are Afghans and Ukrainians. And certain people with parole don't get the refugee benefits. It's wonderfully complicated, everybody. So my point to you here is if you're working with an immigrant kiddo and you're like, hey, maybe this kiddo is working with an agency, maybe not, reach out to your agency, definitely Exodus, to find out, hey, are they eligible for services? Are they not eligible? Who can we refer them to so they can get extra support? And also, don't be surprised if the agency says they can't serve them. We're grant-based. That's the downfall. So just a few of the major countries that we've seen here in Indiana that we've served. So Burma, we have like the second largest Chin, that's an ethnicity in Burma population, second only to Burma itself. We have something like 20,000 Burmese on the south side of Indianapolis. If you ever want to get a glimpse of resiliency, check out the community on the south side of Indianapolis, churches, businesses, thriving community organizations. But conflict has been going on, government takeover. Things got a little bit better a few years ago with the election of a new president, but just in the last year or so, we've seen the government take over again, lots of human rights abuses against minorities, especially the Muslim minority there in Burma, the Rohingya. Forgive me for my pronunciation. The other population we're seeing growth of across the United States actually is Congolese, people from the DRC. There's been conflict here. And let me just phrase, because I assume Dr. Tabby nodding their head. Dr. Tabby and Dr. Cohen are the experts here, like international studies. I'm giving you the elementary viewpoint. But the DRC has been experiencing conflict from the 90s, some spillover from the Rwandan genocide, and ongoing interethnic military issues in the country. I've seen people who've stayed the longest in refugee camps from this population, 30 years, 20, 30 years, people have been living in refugee camps. Raise your hand if you've ever heard about the conflict in Congo. Yep, you don't hear about it. Oh, so yeah, well, yeah. So, but it's a growing population. We've designated it as a population of concern. We're going to increase welcoming them here in the US. Yes, so Eritrea, raise your hand, not the doctors in the room. Of course, you better, but raise your hand or give me a reaction if anyone's heard about the conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Pete, get it? Good. Lisa, yes. So oftentimes I will see, pretty much everyone's heard about Afghanistan, pretty much everyone's heard about Ukraine, and no one's hearing about some of these smaller countries. But there's some really ugly stuff happening on the border there, and we've been welcoming Eritreans for a long time. They have forced enlisting in Eritrea, fighting a war with Ethiopia that has really turned nasty in the last year. So another small population that we welcome. Hello, go back. Syria, I think, is another population that, we've heard of this conflict in the last decade. Civil war breaking out a year ago, lots of human rights abuses from the president there. And something to remember is that conflict does not resolve itself quickly. So even though maybe that's quieted down a little bit in Syria, people are still living in camps, millions of people. And so that's going to feed into when I start talking about Ukraine, actually. So big events that we've seen, right? Afghanistan fell in about a year ago, and they evacuated about 100,000 people out of Kabul. And there's obviously many, many more people in Afghanistan that need to get out, which is really desperate and very heartbreaking for a lot of the families who are here because they've left family members behind. And there's really no pathway for them right now to get here. So this was an unprecedented event in our refugee resettlement history, evacuating people, resettling them in months' time. As I said earlier, this process is years in the making. So what we did was fairly exceptional. We brought people to bases here in the States, essentially processed them quickly through the resettlement agencies. And the other unique thing about welcoming Afghans through this program is they were given parole. Parole is different from refugee status. Refugee status is a pathway to citizenship. It's guaranteed. You cannot be deported as a refugee. It's equal to a death penalty, essentially. Where that remains true for many Afghans, they were given parole, which is a temporary status, but everyone across the country is working to shift their status to asylum so that they can get that pathway to citizenship. We are also hoping, call your congresspeople, y'all, that they will pass the Afghan Adjustment Act, which will automatically make this change, yes, Pete, so that we don't have to go through asylum, guys. Asylum, woo, it's nasty. It's rough. It's a very difficult thing to obtain. It's an extremely lengthy process, and processing 80,000 applications is unheard of. So call your congressperson and tell them to support the Afghan Adjustment Act. But we're actually hitting the tail end of this evacuation. The last base in the UAE is closing at the end of this month. So meaning from a year ago, we will have resettled roughly 80,000 or close to 100,000 Afghans in the country, meaning we can do it. We can resettle lots of people. Uniting for Ukraine. So we are seeing, here's a brief timeline, right? And this is all this year. Russia invades Ukraine in February. In March, Biden says we will welcome 100,000 Ukrainians. And then in April, they launched this program called the U for U, United for Ukraine. This is the government. So they decided instead of going through the resettlement agencies, they were going to create basically what are private sponsorships for Ukrainians. So pretty much anyone that wants to sponsor a family and show that they have the financial resources, support housing, do all of these things that we commit to do as agencies, you can have a family. And that was a decision they made. And then in May, they realized, this is, we're welcoming basically refugees. We need to make sure they're eligible for refugee benefits, because refugees, unlike other immigrants, get access to food stamps, Medicaid, cash assistance. And now they're saying, okay, Ukrainians can access that, which also makes them eligible for some refugee benefits, not all. And in July, what did they do in July? I can't see my full screen. Then they decided, okay, yes, Ukrainians can enroll in refugee programs. So they did it backwards. Yay. And so why am I telling you this? Because so if you're working with the Ukrainian family and you're like, did they resettle through the agency? It's a big question. The answer is no, but they are eligible for our services. So referring Ukrainians, getting assistance for Ukrainians is possible. But the challenge with Ukrainians, also paroled like the Afghans, but the US is not allowing financial support, nor are they trying to coordinate support for Ukrainians to adjust their status. At this point, they're treating Ukrainians as if they will be able to go home in 2 years. Goes back to my point earlier, conflict does not resolve itself in 2 years. And so I anticipate changes to this in the next year about how we're welcoming Ukrainians. That's your lesson for the day. What are some populations? So these are just some breakdown of populations we've welcomed as an agency. Again, this was out of Indianapolis in 2016. Pretty diverse, right? Where we were at close to 1,000 arrivals. And then by the end of Trump's presidency, that had been just, I don't even know, fractioned off, where we only welcomed 130 people. Thankfully, with the new administration, that is changing. So what is resettlement? What do we do, right? And Dr. Cohen knows, actually her and a group of hers have been partnering with us on helping resettle a family here in Bloomington. But we do a lot. So we actually get information before somebody comes, basic information, not a lot. And we go to the airport, we welcome people, we help bring them home, we help find them a home, we help them get benefits, we help kids enroll in school, get with the doctors, and we are able to provide direct financial assistance for around 4 to 5 months. But refugees and those groups of humanitarian concern are eligible for different services for up to 5 years. So that's important for teachers out there to know, because if you're meeting with the family and they're having some concerns, reach out to your local resettlement agency and see if they're eligible for support programs. And if they can't, hopefully they can refer you to places that are able to. This is my most fun thing to share. We get $1,225 per person to be used for 3 months. No, it's not $1,225 each month. It's a one-time. Raise your hand if you can afford, if you can live off of $1,225 over the course of 3 months. Anybody out there really great with money? Nope, nearly impossible. So if you're ever like, man, those resettlement agencies are stingy with their rent payment, it is because we don't get a lot of money from the government to do it. And we have to supplement funding from a lot of different areas, but it's incredibly limited. And that is difficult. Basically, a family has to do a complete turnaround in less than 5 months. Raise your hand if you've ever moved to a new country where you didn't speak the language, totally different culture, and established a new life. I've done this, actually. I was in the Peace Corps by choice, obviously. It took me at minimum a good 8 to 9 months to learn the language. And working, I just hung out. Like, I was just hanging out with people. This is an incredible feat to ask of families. And let me tell you, it's not impossible. It happens every day. But it is a tall ask, and it's a lot for a family when they're going through it. So just some Bloomington, for you Bloomington folk out there. We've welcomed 30 Afghans. Here's some of our breakdown. I am so proud of our little diversity of refugees that we're welcoming with such small numbers, just to show that, you know, we will see people from all over the world in our little city. So now we're going to get into some specifically working with some youth. We've had a youth program for a very long time. So a lot of this comes from the coordinators of that program. And sort of the things that they share with people as well. So some more facts for you, right? So we're currently looking at about 13 million children. So perspective here, there's about 26 million refugees. Over half of that are children. So when you ever want to, you know, some fuel for the fire, someone's like, oh, refugees, be like, they're mostly kiddos. They're mostly children. And around half of them do not attend school. So, and those are some rates of primary enrollment. It's a little bit higher. Secondary enrollments fall to 34%. So what are, you know, barriers here? A lot of families can't afford to go to school. The cost of running schools are really high. The size of the classrooms are going to be large, limited curriculum, and the kiddos just having to support families. I remember working with a Syrian who was 11, and he was the primary caregiver for his family. These are some real life experiences of children you may work with. Family dynamics to remember. There's a lot of role transition in moving to the US. Kiddos learn language faster. Your brain just picks it up. It's science, right? And so they tend to become the little case manager for the family. Whatever you do, avoid ever using a kid as an interpreter and as the case manager. It is a role that they should not be placed into. It is hard because it's a natural role they fill. I mean, Kais talked a lot of this, always being aware of this with the kiddo. You know, is it that they're lazy, or is it they're going through complete and utter culture shock, right? Or is it that they're having PTSD and it's manifesting in these other ways? So just keeping that mind frame when you're working with really any kiddo, right? We don't have time for this, but there's a lot, and slides will be shared. But these are just some general cultural differences, right? America is a very independent culture, and a lot of the cultures we welcome with refugees are interdependent and communally based. And so with that, we see some differences. My favorite one to share, super simple, but with the Burmese population, I would used to teach employment trainings. And I'd sit in training and everyone in the class would have their arms crossed like this. I was like, oh my gosh, they all hate me. Like I'm horrible. I'm doing something wrong. Come to find out, an interpreter finally told me, they're like, that's a sign of respect for teachers, is to cross their arms and to listen to you. And I was like, oh, you know, totally different experience after that, learning that that was a sign of respect. So super mundane, reductionist example, but you get the idea that if you're having an experience, try and step back and evaluate like what culturally might be going on here, or mentally, you know, the mental health aspect of this is really big as well. So things that we should do often, see the assets of our newcomer youth. They are resilient, they're amazing, adaptable. They're going to be leaders in our community. They're leaders amongst their peers. They bring different perspective, cross-cultural communication. They've had to problem solve and flexible. They're not just bilingual, they speak multiple languages. Always exercising cultural humility. I'm sure you've been trained on that, suspending that judgment of culture. Trying to connect what the students and the families value. And this is a big one, this last one, especially in resettlement, clarifying expectations and roles. Sometimes there's very unrealistic expectations of starting life over in America. And the reality is a lot of people are coming and they're occupying low income status in America. And I'm sure teachers know how difficult that is. And sometimes we have to kind of clarify what this really looks like. Avoid things like, don't ask kiddos for their story. Don't ask families for their story. That's trauma. Think of the worst moment of your life. Think of the hardest thing you've been through. You're not sharing that publicly, right? That's personal. So remember that these are personal things. Don't reduce experiences to victims. People are survivors. And I mean, this is why I keep coming back to the work it's a privilege and an honor for me to work with refugees because frankly, I mean, the strength, right, that I like pull. Then we work together and getting to this place of being self-sufficient in the States. And don't generalize experience and religious. That's one I've seen as well. Definitely good to be cautious, but don't generalize. Even within Islam, just like within Christianity, people are going to practice Islam differently. So just be careful about those generalizations. Things to remember: language. You are not providing a service if you are not using an interpreter. You cannot communicate without one if you're working with a family. It is imperative. So getting creative with that. Also, don't use the kiddos. Yeah, and just remembering, and remembering to communicate when you're communicating through an interpreter or in different languages is to do the opposite of me right now. Slow down, use simple terms, and repeat often. And remembering, again, if you're seeing families with other needs, reach out to local agencies to see if they can get assistance. I'm not going to get into this, but working with an interpreter is a skill. I will say that. It's a skill you develop over time, practice. Again, you'll have the slides, but interpretation is imperative. If your school is not offering interpretation like on a regular basis with every interaction, that's an issue, and you need to fix it, because you're not. I know Bloomington schools have an app that you can communicate with and automatically translate. I mean, every school should be using that. I won't get into that. This is my favorite quote, because the refugee problem is not about charity, and not about people to be pitied, but people to be admired. Problem with people who somewhere, somehow, sometime have the courage to give up the feeling of belonging, which they did possess, rather than abandoning the human freedom, which they wanted more. Just remember, always looking at everything we do through a strengths-based perspective. And I think this really sums it up. Thank you guys so much for your time and listening and being here. And thanks for letting me be here.